Ready when you are.
Hello to everybody this evening. How are you all? Everyone looks like they're doing well. Great. I'm just going to do a little housekeeping before we get started with our episode 5 of the Women of Chivalry, the Female Knights Roundtable 2020. For all of our viewers that are watching, by all means, feel free to ask questions. We may not be able to get to all of the questions. We are running tight on time. We just try to stick to a certain time frame. Do not take it personally. It is not personal. And I guess without further ado, that's really all the housekeeping I have. I'm going to pass this off to our lovely hostess.
Hi, I'm Mari Alexander, and I'm from Lochac, and I'll be hosting today. As Vesper said, today we'll be answering a list of questions from the fighters around the world, which are the everything else questions that we haven't gotten to yet. Some of your questions will be answered by all the knights, some will be just answered by a few. You can monitor the feed. Vesper's going to be passing questions to me. We'll try to get to some of them. We do have an episode 6 that we're going to be taking the questions that we haven't gotten to yet and kind of doing a compilation of all of those. We're going to start with each knight introducing themselves. Sir Lena, would you like to start?
Certainly. My name is Duchess Lena of Beckenham. I'm currently in the Mid-Realm, and my main weapon is sword and shield, or more fun, my main weapon is command unit. I've been in the society close to 40 years, and the thing I love about fighting, the engagement of it, the ability to do something with somebody you can't normally do. You get to go all out, you have fun with the person, there's a level of communication you don't get anywhere else. Those are good things for it.
So I'm Elizabeth Mortimer. I'm 56 years old. I live in the Kingdom of Eldamere. I've been in the SCA for 34 years, and my weapon form that I love more than anything is sword and shield. And the thing I like about fighting more than anything is that it's like a chess match, but you use your mind and your body to do it. And it's fun for me it's like a puzzle. If I do X, will you do Y? And when we fight and there's a connection, it is a joy to me. So that's what I like about fighting.
I'm Elfwin. I'm 52. I'm in Eldamere, like Elizabeth there. My favorite weapons form is sword and shield. I've been fighting since 1991. And like Bess, I like the chess game aspect of combat. It's the ebb and flow of the fight, and you get into this real dance, and it's fun to play that game. That's what I really enjoy.
Good day. Excuse me. I'm Sir Kira out of Abacal. I am, I guess, 39 years old now. I've been fighting probably for about 16 years. And I guess the one thing that I really actually love about the SCA in particular, especially combat, is it is the most equal thing that I have ever done. No weight classes, no genders, go.
Hi, I'm Kelwyn Ratslayer. I live in the Kingdom of Artemisia. I'll be 54 next week. My main weapon style is sword and strapped around, but I also love playing with spear in the wars. Fighting just brings me an immense amount of joy. It feeds my soul. The camaraderie out on the field is amazing. I just really love it, all of it.
Excellent. Ladies, we were asked, how many years did it take you to be knighted? And what were the main factors in it taking that specific time period?
So for me, it took 9 years. And if the question is, why did it take 9 years? The answer is I wasn't ready before then.
All right, so it took me 25 years, 1991 to 2016. What I noticed in fighting, and this is male and female, is you get a fighter and they're on the path, like they're heading up towards that bar of knighthood, and either they continue that path and they pass it, or they plateau just before it. And that can be anything. That could be an injury, it could be real world, it could be health, both physical and mental. And it'll either you get knighted in like 10 years, or it takes you 15 to 20 years, because you have to get on that path until something breaks you off of it and pops you back up again. For me, I got knocked off the path. Combination of a bit of politics, a bit of injury. I had depression going on. And I was kicked out of that doldrum and not put back up onto the path again by one of our knights, Sir Nigel, who took an interest in me. He, stepped up and gave me some guidance and some encouragement. And I was really thrilled that he just happened to be king when I was elevated. So that was a nice closing of the circle for me.
I can't remember if it took 6 or 8 years, somewhere in that realm. I've been fighting for basically since the beginning, but there was a point where I decided that I was finally going to just engage in actually getting better at this particular skill. And that took a certain level of commitment. The biggest thing that helped in that time was actually taking over the position of Earl Marshal, Knight Marshal, I guess, in my area. So forcing me to go to practices helped me overcome all of my excuses that kept me from going, which was frankly laziness in a lot of cases. That and traveling actually were the two big things that finally got me over the hump. And that really, really propelled me forward in the time that I decided to pursue this.
So I started fighting in 1990 and I was knighted just last year. So it was just over 29 years between my start and my knighting. The biggest factor for me is I'm a really lazy person and I have a lot of squirrel moments. So when I first started fighting, I went full out, go, go, go every weekend. I had so much fun with it. But after a few years, I stopped going to practices as often. I didn't put any extra time into training. Then I got sidetracked for a while. I worked on a master's. I played women's professional football for a while. That took me away. I had a couple of injuries. I broke my ankle when I was playing football, so I was out for about 6 months there. I had a pulmonary embolism in 2015. That took me out for 9 months. And during that time, I had both my knees replaced. So my knees had been going bad since probably after about 6 or 7 years fighting. And so I didn't really have the desire to do the extra practices and stuff because it was painful at times. But after I got my knees done, I decided I really wanted to invest in my fighting. And so once I did that, I started training, I started doing Pell work, and it was 4.5 years after my knees were done that I got knighted.
So I fought for about 30 years before I was knighted. And why it took that particular length of time for me was a number of factors. I moved a lot of kingdoms. I lived in several kingdoms: Trimaris, West, Meridies, Mid-Realm, Antir. So moving and reestablishing in different kingdoms slowed things down a little bit, in part because I was in the military. Deployments also took their toll on my ability to be visible. And in some cases, it was because I was visible, and that was kind of insulting for some gentlemen who had a problem with me. Some of it was that I was not afraid to teach, and this, for some people, was offensive, and I don't care. I was fighting because I wanted to fight, not for the recognition of it. So if anyone ever asked me, would I change it? No. But the reality is, when you're actually the candidate in the process of being on that path, you are literally the only person who cannot evaluate why you're not being knighted. So to ask me specifically why I wasn't, I don't know. You'd have to ask the Shiv around me why I wasn't.
We've answered some of these questions, this next question in your previous answers, but we were specifically asked that, understanding that everyone's path is different, how old were you when you started heavy fighting, and how old were you when you were knighted?
So I was 23 when I started. I was in the last year of university, so that kind of took some of my time. And then I was 48 when I was elevated.
I was, I guess, 23 when I started, and 38, I guess. No, 37 when I was knighted. That said, though, I kind of dawdled around a lot in my 20s to get my life in track. And then once that happened, I could focus and play more on the SCA. So that's why I ended up in my 30s.
I believe I was 23 when I started, maybe 24, and I was 53 when I got knighted.
I was authorized on my 18th birthday, And I was knighted when I was 48.
Following the trend, I was 23 when I started fighting and 32 when I was knighted.
How important do you think it is to be authorized in multiple weapons forms for those kingdoms that do the authorizations for multiple weapons forms? And how important to fight in tournaments, melees, and wars in terms of obtaining the peerage?
I think it's important to be able to fight with different multiple styles. I don't think it's a requirement. I feel that you should be a fairly well-rounded person when you get knighted, and you don't need to be a master at different weapon styles, but you should be able to understand the basics of those different weapon styles for one reason, so that you can effectively counter those when you're fighting. If you don't understand the basics of those weapons, it's harder to fight against them. As far as if you need to do both tourneys in wars, again, it varies from kingdom to kingdom what kingdoms feel about that. I personally don't understand why people don't want to do both, because they're both tourney and war fighting is a lot of fun, but I do understand some people have preferences. The important thing, though, I think about doing both is you have more exposure, and on your path to knighthood, one of the most important things is for other people to see you fighting. And if you're not out there at the wars or out there at tourneys, you're not going to get your exposure, a well-rounded exposure.
So I believe that you need to be deadly with anything that you pick up. Being a knight is not about being excellent with a weapon. It is being an excellent weapon. And that means it shouldn't matter what you're holding. So should you get authorized in the other forms? Yes, you should become proficient in them. What I like to see in a candidate is they're extremely proficient in at least 2 forms and at least useful in all forms. They should be able to pick up anything. Deadly with anything you pick up.
We were asked a question about misogyny. It seems like there's a lot of misogyny in SCA fighting. A, do you think that's true? B, can you share some experiences or thoughts? And C, how do you deal with it?
So I have to tell you, 2 weeks ago, I would have had a totally different answer to this question. But today, because of what's going on in the States with the Black Lives Matter movement, I will answer it like this. Black Lives Matter teaches us that when a group of people share their lived experiences, we have to listen to it, we have to trust them, and we have to believe it. We have to believe a group of people who say, this is my experience. I have to realize that my lived experience is not their lived experience. And as dismaying as this is to me personally, I have to accept that I am not actually the center of the SCA universe. So I would say that I myself have not experienced misogyny in the SCA, but a lot of women have said that there is. My lived experience is not the truth for a lot of women. My experience, though, does not trump the experiences that many women do have. And I don't get to declare that there is no misogyny in the SCA in the fighter community. And truth is a virtue. So here's my truth. And this one's for you. In the past, I was not as receptive as I think I should have been to women. And there were more than I would like to admit who said they'd experienced misogyny, because that was not my reality. And I know now, and I've learned that was wrong. So to them, I'd like to say, I'm listening, I hear you, and I hope in the future, I'll be a better person for it.
So I'm supposed to follow that one, okay. So misogyny is a very open concept. I mean, it has a lot of different nuances, from overt hostility to people not even realizing what it is they're saying and the effect that it can have. So yeah, I've had guys who were so mad that they couldn't beat me that they, in a melee, ran up and stomped his boot on my foot hard enough to lose one of my toenails, because that was how he expressed his frustration at not being able to beat a woman. And I call that misogyny, because he didn't do it to the male fighters who were defeating him in singles. And then it goes all the way to the other extreme of people just just gendered language for examples. I mean, if you say to a bunch of fighters, come on, ladies, let's go, you're implying that you're being soft and weak and lazy, and because you're calling a bunch of guys a bunch of ladies. So there's a wide spectrum of how this can apply to society and our particular little aspect of society. When this conversation comes up, the example that I give is actually from a coworker. I'm an engineer. I work with the military. I deal with a male dominant environment on a regular basis. And this friend, we were talking about a women's MMA tournament, and he was of the opinion that he, as a male, could walk into that tournament and in the same weight class could easily end up in like the top 5 just because he's a boy. And the experience or the techniques or the capabilities were irrelevant in his head. And I see this sort of attitude in male fighters where they get really confused when they fight me and they're not winning. And sometimes that confusion turns into a conversation, which is great. And sometimes that confusion turns into aggression or rhinoing or any kind of things. So there's a lot of, like I say, there's a lot of different aspects to how this shows up. And the other example that I've seen, certainly as an unbelted fighter, in places that don't know me, because Eldamir is a small kingdom and people know me and they know what to expect from me. And I call it the scan. And they physically will look at your head, your waist, and your crotch. And I call it the hat, belt, dick, right? And if you don't have one of those 3, no hat, no belt, no dick, turn away, find somebody else to go fight. So this is just sort of one of those things that, okay, that's how you're going to be. And the third part of the question is, how do you deal with it? So one of the guys who gave me the scan and decided I wasn't worth fighting and turned to my friend who, no hat, no belt, oh, got a dick, I'll go fight you. And my friend said, well, let's do a little bear pit. And we have all 3 of us. And we did. And my friend and I dominated this third guy. I don't think he won a single fight amongst it. And afterwards, we're sitting watching the fighting, and he didn't look at me. He didn't do anything. He just said, you kicked my ass. And I said, yeah, I did. And that was the end of the conversation. So it was a bit of a learning moment for him in that respect. So how do you deal with it? You can call them on it. You can have the conversation. If they're open to that conversation, sometimes they're not. You can beat them. And by beating them, it isn't necessarily you won the fight, but if they're going to be a dick and they're going to behave dishonorably, then you behave honorably and you have won that aspect of the fight. So it's part of being a woman in a man's sport, and you find ways of dealing with it. And if we can have the conversation like we are now, that's another step in dealing with it. Sorry I took so long on that one.
No problem. There's a lot of history there.
Yeah.
So I'm coming from the perspective of 35 years of fighting in this particular sport. And I'll tell you that there has been development over that time frame. When in one of my early Penzics, there was a group of guys who went around deliberately targeting to hurt female fighters. It was 35 years ago, but there was a group that thought that was okay. Now they were banished, but it stuck with me that we created an organization where somebody thought that was okay. It's not. And ultimately that group was banished. The crown that sponsored them was banished. The whole thing was stomped on with a big hobnail boots. 20 years ago, it was there somewhat. 10 years ago, it's there less. So we've made progress, and some of the hurdles that are being faced today aren't nearly the hurdles that were faced before, but they're still there. And to that, you just have to, it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't me. My same reactions, the very same things that I did would sometimes endear me to a fighter, or it would make that fighter angry at me, and they'd take it out on me. And it took me a long time to realize that if my action is the same and their reaction is different, it's not me. It's not me that's created it. And finally, I came to realize that it often is wrapped around a person's definition of self. And if they've defined their masculinity as I can dominate any female I want, and then they find a female they can't, I've attacked their masculinity. Now, it really is a case of they've got a bad definition of masculinity, but that seemed to be what was angering them. And to that, it was like, I am what I am. If you don't like the reaction, get a better definition of self. So for me, how to deal with it was finally realizing that that person's anger about my being on the field isn't about me. So I'll go out and enjoy myself anyway.
I have a hard time with this question, much like a lot of the folks that came before me. The time that was and the time that is now is not the same. The long story is yes. My kingdom in and of itself is actually, I would say, quite healthy. And instances of misogyny either are immediately dealt with or just don't really crop up anymore. I do, however, find that it tends to happen when I go out of kingdom. Recently, I was down visiting on tier in January, and it consistently seems to be a generational gap. I don't know if it's because I'm some small girl out there who seems to be doing well, but I have had an individual consistently, and I don't know why, targets me. I have watched this person walk past an entire other group of knights to interrupt me discussing with one of the royals at the time to impose advice upon me. And all I remember doing was staring at this individual, looking at my belt, and looking back up at him. And I was stunned. Maybe it's the Canadiana in me. My first reaction is to try and be polite and be civil about the matter. I'll be honest, I raged pretty badly after the fact. I don't know what it takes for people to, why? So I suppose the next time I meet this individual, it's going to come hell or high water. And I don't care if this individual has a reputation throughout as being an excellent individual, but it is still fresh. That still really bugs me, actually. Other ones that really surprise me every once in a while, even though I've known fighters for all of my fighting career, it seems that there was a moment that I passed them. And I ran into an episode last year where, a couple of passes with an individual, I knew I hit this person. I knew it was a good shot. I was confident in all of my abilities to have that person look me in the eye and go, no. And then I find out after the fact that indeed I had hit this individual hard enough to leave a bruise. And really? You couldn't admit that to me? Is it just because at some point while you were taking a break, I got better? So I admit I don't run into it often enough. My first reaction generally is to try and be polite and civil about the matter. I do find that I still get pretty heated about it. And I have to chew through a little bit of frustration to not go back to the individual at some point because it's not going to help. So if I can't address it by being polite, then you try humor. And that usually tends to work. And if humor doesn't work, then it's by the sword.
Thank you, ladies. That was a tough question. You guys answered it very well. There are many more female fighters now than when I started fighting, and this is from Lord Sergio from Glenavon, and that was almost 40 years ago. However, I still don't think that females are represented in the chivalry in a comparative fashion. Do you feel the same? If so, why do you think that is, and how can we improve upon it? We've looked at some numbers, so here's our answer.
So we can't really say for sure if we're underrepresented or not, because we really don't know how many authorized fighters there are out there that are male, how many authorized fighters there are that are female. However, I did put together a graph, and if Vespa would love to put that up for me, thank you. It's based on a 5-year running average over the entire life cycle of the SCA. So for example, if you look at 1985, between the years of 1981 and 1985, 215 individuals were elevated to the Order of Chivalry. 7 of them were women. That was one of the peaks early on. And then you can see we go back down, but then we start to steadily climb up. And then when you get to 2019, which includes the numbers from 2015 to 2019, there were 345 individuals elevated and 17 of them were women. Each of those 5 years that were represented in there had at least 3 women that were knighted. So I feel like we've definitely seen some huge strides in women fighting. For one, like you mentioned in your question, there are a lot more women fighting. More women are being taken seriously, so they are continuing to advance because we now realize that, or people are realizing that women, yes, we do want to fight and we do love fighting. So I think the best way we can work on this is just, if you're out there, don't assume a woman who's out there isn't out there to be serious, or that she's just out there for the day or whatever. Take them serious. Give them the same consideration you would any fighter that steps on that field. There's really not that much of a difference. Don't assume they aren't going to continue, and invest the same amount of energy in the women who come out that you do when a man comes out. And also, if you can have some loner gear that's available that might be more fitting towards women, because we are built slightly different, that would help a lot as well.
So I hadn't seen that graph before, and that's really cool. On the low point right before it starts to take off, the steady climb upward, that's where I published the book, The Armored Rose. And it really was a book written because there wasn't a lot of instruction that was specific to a female body. And I had gotten quite a bit from the military. I had gotten quite a bit from drill sergeants who were all explaining physically different soldiers respond differently. And a lot of that psychology was in that book. I had a very well-known Duke and instructor at the time tell me that he thought it was all hogwash, and gave it very little credit, and said that if it really did have any merit, that we would see more female fighters in the future. And to put in perspective, every 5 years since that date, since he told me that, we have doubled the number of female fighters. I don't try to claim that it's because of the book, but I will say that we started on a path of accepting and learning from ourselves. So I'm thrilled to find out that, yeah, every 5 years we have doubled the number of female knights, and we haven't doubled the number of fighters in the SCA. So I think we're gaining on that percentage. I hadn't seen that graph before, and I want to thank you for putting that one up there. That was really good.
We had a question about the buffets. In each kingdom, the buffet's given slightly differently, has different symbolism. Did you have a buffet? And if so, can you describe it and what it symbolizes to you?
Yes, I did have a buffet. So full disclosure before I start talking about that, I know there's some questions in, especially outside of the fighting community, about the buffet and issues about physical abuse. My history is more emotional and mental abuse, not physical. So being punched wasn't a trigger for me. I just wanted to say that from the get-go. For the buffet, I had a very open conversation with the king about it. He asked specifically, do you want it, and where and how? So we talked about that. I wanted it on the shoulder. I wanted it with just the palm of the hand. And he asked me specifically about power. And I said I wanted it solid, but not, concussion levels. Because he was perfectly prepared to go whichever I wanted. What it means to me, in the ceremony and traditionally in Eldamir, the line is, let this be the last blow you accept unanswered. And for me, that means don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. And it's something that I actually have in the back of my head sometimes when I might back down on an issue, going, no, that is a blow and I can't leave that unanswered. So the question is, how I felt about it. The whole process of the buffet was stock. It was great. The weird thing about my personal one was how the rest of the order reacted, because usually the king hits the candidate, accepts the blow, everybody goes hooray. When I moved to say hello to the rest of my new order, the prince stepped forward and said, I want to hit you too. Okay, so he buffeted me, so I hit him back because that's the rule, and he was kind of surprised. And then I came off the dais, and the next knight hit me, and then the next knight hit me, and I started, this is weird. And the fourth knight came up to me and he said, "I'm going to hit you too." And by this point I had it. And I'm like, no, I'm not getting punched in the shoulder by the entire order. So he punched me and I just let go and right into his sternum. I heard his chest go, "Ugh," and his eyes got like really big. So Mordain, if you're watching, my apologies, because I know you didn't mean it this way, but the way I was taking it was that I was still having to prove myself worthy, even though you had just finished voting for me to come in. So I know everybody was just being jocular and they got kind of caught up in the moment, but that's actually the only downside to my elevation in that respect. So that's my Buffett story.
So yes, I did have a Buffett. In all my readings that I'd done when I was working on my ceremony, I did see reference to the Buffett. Plus, in all the years I've been in the SCA and watched knighting ceremonies, the Buffett was one of the really cool parts about the ceremony that really stuck in my mind. Before my knighting, I had heard a rumor that somebody had put out there that instead of the king giving me the Buffett, it was going to be the queen. And that really bothered me, not because I don't have the same respect for my queen that I do for my king, but I did not want to see a tradition changed because I was the first woman to be knighted while we, as a Kingdom of Artemisia. We do have another female knight that was knighted when we were part of Atenveld. Fortunately, my crown, the king did give me my Buffett. I had a full slap to the side of the face while I was kneeling. It definitely made my head rock. It was exactly what I wanted because it was no different than the other candidates that had been knighted during his reign. And it was like the first symbol to me that really made me feel like I was truly a knight. Unlike Ilflyn, when she was talking about what happened with her after her Buffett, in our kingdom, it is tradition for all the knights to hit the new knight and receive a Buffett back. And so they all generously gave me their typical punches so I could punch them back. One of the cool things about the whole ceremony was I had a gentleman who came just to watch my ceremony. He is works for the Idaho State Police, and he's a fan of the SCA. He just doesn't play in the SCA, and he really wanted to come to my knighting. So he thought it was really cool when they did the Buffett, and he was really surprised at how hard the hit really was. So I definitely think the Buffett is cool, but it's up to everybody to make that decision for themselves.
So I am one of those people that didn't have a Buffett. It was a really long time ago when I got knighted. And when I think back, I think that they were just kind of starting to be, part of the ceremony, at least as I recall at the time. I didn't, and I don't take any slight because I didn't have one. Were I to get knighted now, I would probably ask for a Buffett, much like it's been described, a stout blow, but nothing excessive, because that's part of the historical tradition, but also the SCA tradition. But I didn't have it at the time, and I'm not unduly upset about that.
So I did have a Buffett, and I think that the crown, who did it perfectly, was probably more nervous than I was. He literally was standing between my husband, who was a duke, and my son, who was crown prince. And he had to give me a Buffett. Keep in mind that during this ceremony, it isn't about abuse. There's a discussion that happens between the candidate and the crown, and none of it is a surprise. They specify strength, where, how, and it's an agreement between the two. And I've rarely, if ever, heard of that agreement ever being violated. So here was my crown, and I was the first knight that he had elevated. He's now a duke, but I was the first knight. And he was probably incredibly nervous about it, considering where he was standing and the fact that he's about to strike a woman and there's plenty of camera coverage over it. He apparently got one of his squires to be a test buffettee who took a dozen practice shots beforehand. So it really was kind of amusing. In my ceremony, there's also, I had it done at Gulf Wars so that as many people from across the known world could see or participated in it that wanted to, because I had fought and been in a number of kingdoms, and a lot of people wanted to be there. And during my vigil the night before, the King of the East came to me and said, and who was a good friend, said, I really want to counter buffet you, but I'd like to know if you're okay with that. And the counter buffet is what Elfin was talking about, being punched in response and expecting to go ahead and strike the person back because you've already taken the last unanswered blow. And I told him, I'm already exhausted. It's 3 a.m. I'm not going to get sleep before I fight all day long and I get knighted halfway between the day and the next battle. So I honestly don't know how tired I'm going to be. Please understand I'm a combat veteran. If you surprise me, I'm not 100% sure that I'm not going to give you an immediate reaction. Be sure that we have a good understanding that this is a game and I'm fine with it. And as soon as I stood up from my knighting, after they've put all the accoutrements on me, he's the first person who jumps out, grabs me by the shoulders and says, look at me, we good? We good? And then he punches me. And my immediate response was to hit him so hard back that I knocked him into his crown prince. And everybody looked at that and went, yep, that's good. And that was the only counter buffet I got that day. I can't imagine why. So please understand that it's a discussion that happens ahead of time for what both crown and candidate are comfortable with. And most people will kind of clear with you either by tradition or specifically anything associated to a counter buffet.
Thank you. That was very insightful, especially with some of the inter-kingdom anthropology. Do you ever feel that male fighters hold back when they're fighting you? And how do you counter that mindset?
Yes, but I only get one. Actually, the worst thing that happened in that sense was that I got knighted and it took away my advantage of being underestimated. I actually, for a lot of years, got really upset. And I've heard this discussion happen before, actually, with other women out there, where they go out there and they say, I'm not being respected on the field. And I thought long and hard about that answer. And my answer to that is, so the best thing that you could possibly have is to take every advantage that they give you. And if that advantage is, frankly, that they don't see you as a threat, then you take it to their teeth. But I guarantee you, you'll only ever get one. And it really sucks in a round robin because I only get 1 or 2 rounds. And then after that, everybody's on their guard. Suddenly I have to prove it. But that is probably the best way to do it. Own it. Don't expect any respect. Every fighter runs into that at some point in their life. At some point, somebody's going to walk onto that Eric and dismiss you. That's fine. Run with it. At that point, then, it may take a little bit more skill. It may take a little bit more convincing, but in the end, you'll be the better fighter for it. And the people around you will see it too. So.
I'm going to agree with what Sir Kira said. And yes, I have had people hold back on me because of my gender. Really, the only way to counter that mindset is just to fight your own fight. You can't control what somebody's going to think of you. All you can do is give it your best. I can tell you that I've had more than one male fighter come up to me after a fight and say they will never underestimate a woman fighter again because I just kicked them out of a tournament because they lost to me. So just keep in mind that it really sometimes doesn't really have to do with your gender, and people are just think they're a better fighter than they are, and they'll underestimate people for the weirdest reasons.
So the question was, do you ever feel that a male fighter holds back when they're fighting you? Not twice. Really, not twice. And if they do it the first time, I consider it a gift. You have walked on the field and given me the best advantage possible. You're not on your guard. You haven't got the adrenaline running. You've just given me a huge advantage in a fight. So yeah, I'll look at that as a gift. But very rarely do people underestimate me twice. I wish they would. So I kind of look at it as humor and recognize it as a gift they can give me.
So I have 2 answers for this question. Well, no, 3. Tourneys, wars, anywhere I'm wearing a belt, I don't feel that people go easy on me. But say I'm at practice. When I'm at practice, I don't wear my belt or anything. I just put on my armor and I fight. So the locals know who I am and they don't go easy on me. Even when I kind of wish they would, because like I'm really tired, they don't. Sometimes we have out of town guests who come to our practices, and because I'm not wearing a belt or anything, they see, you know, a little old lady, and nobody wants to beat up on their grandma. And so we fight, and then they end up, you know, realizing that I can't fight, and then it progresses normally. But I do want to say that in the second case, sometimes people do hold back. Sometimes I hold back, particularly at practices. And here's the reason why. In an extreme example, imagine somebody who's unauthorized has come to practice. As a knight, if I come out and wail on them, well, that does them no good and possibly drives them out of fighting and maybe out the SCA. And that's not good for all of us. So I'll be 10% better than them. And then as they get better, I'll get better. And as they get better, and I'll get better. And it can seem frustrating because they may feel like they don't progress. After we've been fighting together for a couple of months, I'll say to them, this is what I'm doing. You're getting better and you may not feel it, because as you get better, I get better. So of course, and eventually this stops, but I think it's important to say that, yes, sometimes people will go easy on at practice, say, because sometimes that's the right thing to do, to not beat up on somebody who doesn't deserve it.
So I agree with whatever else is said. So I've got a couple other points that are a different aspect of it. What I have seen from male fighters is them accepting blows from female fighters that they wouldn't have taken from, say, a more experienced female fighter or from the male fighters of a comparable skill level. And it's an observation, but it tends to be go up. They're more likely to take a light blow from a girl the cuter she is. And that might be a male protective thing, or, gee, you're really trying hard, so I'll take that. And I've warned some of our newer female fighters that this can happen and to watch for it and call them on it. If you don't think that blow is good, don't take it. Make them fight you at the level that they should be fighting at, because taking it easy on you isn't going to make you a better fighter. What I've seen in personal experience at both practice and at tournament, in fact, at a crown tournament, is a male fighter, I'm fighting them, and when you're fighting somebody at an equal level and you go up that extra gear, you can usually see it in that other person's body language or their facial expression. You can see them, okay, you got to try a little harder. And on two occasions, once at a practice and once in a crown tourney, they apologized first. And it's like, sorry, darling, this is coming. And it's like, we're in a crown tournament. I expect your top game. Why are you apologizing to me for going that little bit harder? So that was really condescending. The other aspect that came to mind is some guys have been raised to never strike a woman. And then when they get on the field, they're in this sort of mental conundrum. I'm not allowed to hit women. So I was actually invited once. We have a group not far from here. It's at a military base. And they have a lot of new people coming in the combat arms. And I was invited up specifically as, at the time, unbelted, but specifically as a female fighter to go up and fight these guys and help them with that mind block. And so I remember chatting with this guy who's a young soldier, and she's like, oh, I've always been raised, never hit a woman, and I don't know what to do. And I said, okay, put on your helmet, let's go. So we went out on the field and we did some sparring, and I hit him in the head, not hard. And his eyes went, hey. I'm going, okay, you get it now? And he's like, yeah, okay. And then he was fine. So sometimes you just have to have that conversation and talk to them and say, okay, this is where we're at. This is how the game is played. And then they will move on. So anyway, a couple other ways of looking at the question.
Thank you. Stephen Doyle asked, do you think there's anything in the SCA combat rule set that disadvantages women specifically?
So to be sure I was up on the rules, I looked for the most current version of the SCA Marshal's Handbook, which is dated 2019. And if I know Vesper, she's posting a link on it really soon. I didn't find anything in the rules specifically that disadvantage a woman at a society level. There may be kingdom rules that I'm not aware of, and if so, I can't comment on that. But I would like to take a moment here and talk about my favorite rule of the list, rule number 6. At every authorization, we are forced to ask, have you read and do you understand the rules of the list and the Convention of Combat? And every fighter in the world will go, yes, I have. And I say, what's rule number 6? And they go, I don't really know. And I won't sign off on any authorizing paperwork until they can tell me what rule number 6 is. And here's rule number 6 and the application of rule number 6. Combatants shall behave in a I wrote it down. Combatants shall behave in a knightly and chivalrous manner and shall fight according to the appropriate society and kingdom conventions of combat. The application of rule number 6 says, engaging in any society combat with the deliberate intent to inflict bodily harm to an opponent is strictly forbidden. I think personally, this is the most important rule of the list because without it, we're a bunch of thugs with sticks. So while it's a bit of a sidetrack, that's my answer. And my favorite rule of the list, rule number 6.
Well, that's a good segue because I grew up in that tradition and people have come to know no rule 6 because you get asked it. So I started asking, what's rule 7? And rule 7 is you don't have to fight if you don't want to. So if you as a female fighter or a smaller fighter or whatever feel that you're not comfortable meeting this opponent on the list field, you have the option of walking away. That is in the rules. So that is one of the things but the question was, does the rules affect women specifically? And I agree with Bess. No, there isn't. There are rules that both advantage and disadvantage people who are smaller of stature. So the calibration rules allow people who are smaller of stature to compete at all, because if it was just no holds barred, I wouldn't be playing. That's not a game I can play. It's not a game I want to play. So calibration advantages people of smaller stature, but there are also rules that are disadvantaged. For example, the incidental contact, or I should say the application of incidental contact. So the idea was when you're in close and you accidentally hit somebody with your shield, that's not illegal. But in some places that has been taken, I'm allowed to hit people with my shield. So I went to another kingdom, I walk into a tournament, the first fight, his opening combo was shield punch to the face and then a backhand. And then he got mad because I blocked both and then hit him in the head. So that application is not helping the people who are smaller of stature. When I was Earl Marshal, there was a question about allowing death on the ground, where somebody gets knocked over, you're allowed to just call them dead. And I fought that tooth and nail, because all that's going to do is mean all the big guys just walk around pushing people over and then calling them dead. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I spent approximately half of Penzic getting up from getting knocked over. So that is a rule that potentially could have severely disadvantaged the smaller fighters. So do they disadvantage women? No. Do they disadvantage small people? Yes. Do they advantage small people? Yes.
What do you look for in a potential squire, and how do you approach the squire relationship?
I am a new enough knight that I haven't taken any squires yet. I will say that I've been a pelican for 25 years and I never took a protege. One of the things that when I do decide to look for a squire, I'm going to consider is how serious is this person about the path of knighthood? Do they just want to be a better fighter, or do they want to look at all the aspects of what it is important to be a knight? Obviously, their personality, if they laugh at my jokes, that's going to be a big thing. Because if you don't laugh at my jokes, we're not going to make it. Because my feeling is, if I have a squire, they're going to travel with me whenever I go. I'm going to take them along if they can go. So we have to have a similar sense of humor, and we just have to really have the same understanding and beliefs of what it is to be a knight.
So for me, when I look for a squire, it's much the same as Kelwyn. I look for somebody who I mesh with, that I could sit in a car with for a lot of hours on the way to an event. I look for a squire who's open to working hard, not just on the field, but off the field as well. And they have to be receptive to my feedback. I mean, it's good if they're receptive to everybody else, but they have to be receptive to me. And just as a knight reflects on a squire reflects on a knight. So in my own mind, I have definitions. I'm not really sure what it is of what a good person is. And to me, my squires must be good people. And it's very important that we both want the same thing from the relationship. So we have a lot of conversations, we talk a lot, we discuss what we both want. Some people in the conversation, it may turn out that they want something that I can't give them, I am not the right knight for them. And I will say to them, I'm not the right knight for you. And they, it may come to pass that I want something and they're like, oh yeah, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I think that's really super important to me. It is also very important to me that my entire household gets along. So before I speak to, or before I talk to somebody new about becoming a squire, I will talk to the other people in the household, because we're going to be together. And it's important that if we're not all friends, at the very least, we can all get along. And then there is one very important thing that I do that is very traditional, and it must happen. It's a rule. It's part of our ceremony. And that is, they need to give me a kilo of M&Ms. In American, that's 2.2 pounds. It started when I was a squire. My squire brothers all gave me M&Ms. So I'm like, okay. But the one thing that I do that I think is really important, and I don't know that a lot of knights do, is my relationship with my squires, my contract with my squires is for a year and a day. Usually when you become a squire, you're sort of a squire for life, unless you become a knight, or you have to give up your belt, and there could be a lot of drama. So I explicitly state for all to hear in the squiring ceremony that this will be for a year and a day. And in a year and a day, we will get back together and we will discuss if the relationship is working for us. And if it's not, no harm, no foul, we both go on our ways, because we knew it was going to be just for a year and a day. If we do continue for another year, then we talk about where we want to go and what we want to do and how we want it to be. And it doesn't have to be like a big fat hairy conversation like, hey, does this work for you? I'm okay with it. Okay, let's go. But the time limit, that's super important to me, because it makes me check in with my squires. And really, for any relationship, you have to check in, you have to see how it's going to make sure that it's still on track. And so when we're checking, I'm like, am I still the knight for you? Because I might not be. Things may have happened in the past year that you're like, oh yeah, Bess, I thought it was going to work, but it's not. So for me, the year and a day thing really is very important.
So when I started, I guess I was about 5 years in when I was squired, and that relationship didn't work out for various reasons. So gave back my belt, and then I was looking around and I started thinking about what is it that I need in that relationship for me. And I was looking at the knights, and then I was thinking, why am I looking at the knights? Why aren't I looking at all peers? Because all peers are the same, right? They're all equal. They're all the same rank. And if I'm learning fighting or whatever from anybody, then my specific peer is guiding me in my journey, not necessarily in my specific skill set. So I kind of changed my perspective on what the peer dependent relationship was. And rather than looking in these very specific columns that we very handily color coded, I looked at, okay, who are the peers that I know, and which one of these peers is somebody I think can provide me the guidance I need on my path in my SCA career. And I ended up asking a lady who was a Laurel. And I did ANS, just a completely different ANS than she did. And so we had a very interesting conversation on that, because I pretty much blindsided her on my request, and she took me on, and it worked really well. And I owe her a great deal in my growth. So when I became Laureled in 2003, I maintained the same perspective, and it's really at odds with the SCA culture, which is very color coded, especially in fighting, because that red belt has a lot of status, even though it has no rank. So the way I look at it is, I am a peer, and my job is to give my dependent of whatever flavor guidance in their path. Okay, you're messing up, straighten up, or you should talk to so-and-so, or you should go to such and such an event, or you should fight so-and-so. And then I give feedback back and forth with, say, like I have a squire, he lives a ways away from me, local knights fight him, and we talk back and forth and say, okay, we talked about this, we can work on that. Can you try this at your next practice? So I see my role as more of a coordination effort, as opposed to, I'm going to teach you how to throw a flat snap, which I will do if that's what's called for. So what I look for in a dependent is someone that I think I can help. And as Beth said, somebody that, I get along with. The rule of thumb sort of is this somebody that you wouldn't mind crashing on your couch or your spare room for a month? And if you can't handle that, then maybe you're not going to be a good fit. So the other thing I would recommend, if you're somebody who's looking for the squire route or dependent route of whatever flavor, don't go too early. A lot of people get into peer relationships very early in the SCA career, and they don't realize what sort of options they have. And then now that they're in this little social unit, they feel socially constrained to stay in that. My dependents, we have a 1-year trial, like Elizabeth was saying. Let's go that year and see how things work out. If it still seems to be comfortable, great. If it's not comfortable, you can walk away with no social constraints or any concerns, because we're all very open about it from the get-go.
This one was a little hard for me, actually. I had a very, ultimately a very broken relationship, and my squiredom ended up ending actually before I was elevated. So as a result of that, I haven't been a knight terribly long. I'm still in the process in a lot of ways, trying to sort out exactly what I would look for in an individual. I know that I would want somebody who is committed, who, like everyone else has indicated, has a certain personality that would mesh with mine. I'm not the easiest person I know for a lot of people either to approach or to get to know very easily, just the nature of the beast. And I'm not sure that will necessarily ever change. So I'm a little bit worried about ruining the next generation that comes after. That said, I will help any individual who comes my way. Thankfully in Abacal, and like a lot of places, we actually also do the same concept of a year or a year and a day, but here it will be a men-at-arms. So the tradition, and it's starting to become more and more common now, is if you're interested in that kind of relationship, approach a knight, and it may not be necessarily the knight that you want, and have a discussion with them saying, I'm interested. And I know actually my knight brother has been doing this lately. He's been out matchmaking, which has been actually kind of interesting to watch. So where he is not necessarily the knight they're looking for, he will pursue a few other knights on your behalf, which is actually an interesting way to get over sort of the intimidation factor that a lot of people feel about just randomly approaching a knight, because for some reason they're in two camps. Some knights expect you to come to them, and others get really offended by that and will push the squire away and would prefer to go and speak to the squire. That always bothered me, because you're not a mind reader. As a fighter out in the universe, how are you supposed to know, if that's going to be the trigger that will mean that knight will never speak to you again? And that's really unfair. So I'm actually really glad to see that this is happening. And again, I would approach that as a year and a day, where it would be, I would take you as a man-at-arms, we would have that discussion, and if it turns out that I couldn't be that individual for you, very notably because I have a very particular style, a very particular personality, then I will help you move forward to somebody who can. We have quite a diversity here. My situation is a little bit further complicated in that my significant other is also a knight, and his family is quite extensive. So at this point, it would be a blending of two families, which would be kind of interesting in and of itself. So at this point, I would be looking for commitment, for compatibility, and after that, who knows?
Excellent. What do male instructors need to know that is different about the training or teaching of a female?
Stop saying get stronger. I can't express how much that irritates me on so many levels. I am a little fighter. I will never get stronger. I don't want to be stronger. I don't want to be a giant bear out on the field. So what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that they're given cast-off equipment where they end up fighting a lot of it. A lot of times they're given big equipment, heavy equipment, and a lot of dropout rates tend to happen from women who just get frustrated because right from the get-go, they're essentially handicapped. And this answer that fighting is based extensively on strength is personally, I think, fundamentally flawed. And if I can be a physical testament to that, then there it is. I don't have the strength, I never will, but I know I can lace you with a shot hard enough to bruise your ribs. That is technique and physics. So taking some of that into account, I think, is good. Second thing is don't overpraise. This was touched on previously. If a fighter, a female fighter in particular, and it's true, I hate to say it, but there is a propensity that if she's cuter, they tend to get a lot more help. And it's just the nature of the beast. I don't hold it against you, but if it is something that you see happen, call people on it. If you see it in yourself, be aware of it. Because what ends up happening is that you have now overpraised that individual, say in a practice scenario. And then they get out into a tournament and they get their asses handed to them. And they wonder why. And I have been that person. I have been there in the corner crying, wondering why all these people suddenly weren't taking my shots. And it took me a long time to realize that they were trying to bolster me up, to make me better. But when everything push came to shove, it was hindering me. So I had to unlearn a lot of bad technique, frankly, so that I could finally put myself on par with the people around me. And I guess that's overpraising is kind of the same. I call it baby elephant chaining, the same thing. Do not let a female take a shot in practice that you would not accept in a tournament. Not ever, not once. What this does is, again, it's a forerunner. It lays the groundwork for bad technique, and it absolutely derails the mental mindset that you will develop. And it took me a lot of years to work through other people's good intentions that I took to heart and held me back.
I definitely agree with Sir Kira on that. You should not overpraise. Treat the women fighters out there the same as you would with the male fighter when it comes to providing them input on how they're progressing. Don't forget, though, that we do have boobs when you're showing people how to do shots, because boobs make a huge difference on how you can throw shots. I just want to stress that definitely makes a difference. I think one of the main differences that I have seen in all the years that I've been playing sports and a fighter is more of a mental aspect of training and teaching. When I was playing football, one of the things I noticed is that women tend to internalize negative talk a lot more than men do. We had a coach who liked to yell a lot about how we were playing like shit, or that we needed to pull our heads out of our asses and really get out there on the field and go, go, go. He thought he was inspiring us to prove him wrong. But the reality was most of the women on the team kind of shut down because they internalized this and they felt like, oh my God, I'm so horrible. I can never do this. So it seems like it's more typical for when a man is approached that way, it kind of inspires him to prove that person wrong. And yes, I can do it. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to prove you wrong. And I'm going to show you how good I am. I'm kind of that girl too. I mean, I'm kind of that way as well. but there's a lot of women who aren't. So keep that in mind when you're working with somebody. Are they the kind that's going to internalize that negative talk? Or are they going to take it and run with it? So in other words, what I'm saying is, when somebody is like, for example, if you're working with somebody and they throw a shot wrong, don't tell them that their shot sucked. Explain to them why that shot did not land properly. That's it.
Okay. Couple things. Obviously, this isn't 100%. It's not always women and not always men, but in general. So a couple of things that I would pay attention to. First one, body mechanics. When you're smaller stature and you may not be coming in with a lot of athletic background and you need 80% perfect form for that shot to be considered good, you can't cheat on your body mechanics. So for somebody to then tell me, well, just hit harder, that doesn't work. And it's just incredibly frustrating because I don't know what it is I'm doing wrong. So something as simple, I had a lot of problem with my power coming in, and my male instructors who were quite a bit bigger than me were just, we'll just hit harder, we'll just hit harder. And it wasn't until I was watching, I think, boxing or UFC, and somebody made some comment about, oh, his weight's on his back foot instead of his front foot. I'm like, that's my problem. That was my problem, is that I wasn't transferring my weight from the back to the front. And that's how small a difference it can make between my shot being good and not good. So pay attention to these really fine details. Another aspect of that is posture. So I had a lot of shoulder problems for a long time. And what I finally, again, after 15 years, people just saying, we'll go to the gym and do exercise, doing all my weight training. And what I finally realized is that when I'm in the gym, I'm, shoulders open, doing my exercises. As soon as I got on the field, I closed in. And this is, again, it can be a male female thing, where men in a confrontational situation, their immediate response is shoulders back, chest out, look at me, I'm big, I'm threatening. While a woman's response would tend to be, I am small, I am weak, please don't hurt me. And what that does is it puts your shoulders out of position. Now your deltoids aren't working properly and you can't hold your shield up for very long. So again, pay attention to these little things, because that small difference is the difference between her staying and fighting and quitting. I couldn't get past, the fourth round of a tournament because my shoulders would give out. The other thing that I would pay attention to is learning style. As an example, when I tried mountain biking, I bought a mountain bike, I signed up for a 2-day course, and I took my course to learn how to mountain bike. And I was telling a friend of mine, he said, why? I just bought a mountain bike and I went out on the trails and I ran into trees for a couple of days until I figured it out. So again, this is a learning style. So some people want to learn the basics first and then do the application, and other people want to be the application first. So don't just take somebody and throw them in armor on their first day and send them onto the field, because if that's not how they learn, they'll quit. And I've heard male instructors saying, that's the only way to learn. Like, well, no, that's the only way you can teach. There's something like 8 different learning styles. And if you're only coaching in one of those, then for 8 people who come through the door, you'll only keep one of them and the other 7 will walk. So if you're not getting through, change how you teach to match your students' learning style. The other place where I notice this, I also teach motorcycling. So this is taking people who've never been on 2 wheels in their life, you put them on a bike, and by the end of the weekend, they're taking the test for their road test. And when I first started doing this, one of the male instructors, we're having a little group chat, and he commented on women, and he said it was always the girls who would do a maneuver, they'd do it perfectly, and then they'd be mad at themselves and say, oh, I did it wrong. And I remember having a female fighter who did the same thing, threw this beautiful flat snap, and oh, I did it wrong. And when I was talking to this motorcycle instructor, he said, look, I told her, don't be stupid, you're doing it great. And that is entirely the wrong way to deal with that situation. because it's not encouragement, you're discouraging her. So I did a little bit of research into it, and it's people who are goal-oriented versus people who are process-oriented. So in the motorcycle example, one of the exercises we do is a U-turn in a box. And we'd have usually a male rider who would be in the box and he's feet and arms, and we don't know why the bike hasn't stalled out and he didn't crash, but he does the U-turn. And then you say to him, hey, this is how you can improve it. And he's like, don't bother me, I did the thing, right? He is goal-oriented. All he cares is that he did the thing. And you see the same thing in fighting. You throw this absolutely horrible shot, it lands, it was good, and that's all he cares about. The fact that he's going to wreck his shoulder or his elbow in 10 years, he doesn't care. Because right now, that shot is good, and that's his goal. Process-oriented is, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this, and I do this. So I have a female student who is doing this beautiful U-turn, better than I could do, better than the senior instructor could do. And she's like, oh, I did it wrong. So I said, okay, what did you do wrong? Well, I needed to look where my exit point is, and I wasn't looking soon enough. Okay, circle around, try it again. And we did that, easily a dozen times over and over and over in 2 directions until she had it down. And even though she was getting the right goal because the process was off, she was mad at herself. So the same thing with your students. If you have that fighter who throws this beautiful flat snap and says, oh, I did it wrong. Okay, what didn't you do right? Oh, I didn't get my weight transfer down. Okay, let's work on that, right? So this is your learning style, and it isn't exclusively male, female, but is often male, female. There we go.
Right. So what are some of the things that are different? There are some particular things that were mentioned earlier. There are physical differences, and I don't mean the secondary sexual characteristics. Yes, women have boobs, and while that plays a part in it, also recognize that her tendon structure is going to be a little bit different, and that's going to change the angle in which the shots come in. Her hips are different. They're wider, deeper, and at an angle that aren't at the same guy's angles. So her movement is going to be different. And as you get better at fighting comes down to micromillimeters of timing. And the slight difference in the physical structure does make a difference in generating power and technique. So recognize there are physical differences and go for what works, not necessarily for what works in your body as the instructor. Another thing to realize is that she is likely to express frustration differently than a guy. So a guy's going to express frustration with anger. He might throw his helmet down. He might ball up his fists and get grumpy at something. He might shout and yell at it. Those are all expressions of frustration and anger. More often than not, women will express their frustration and anger with giggles or tears. And neither is less valid than any version that the man is using to express frustration with, but they're just different methods of releasing that frustration. One of the worst things that a male instructor can do for a female is that if she comes to the point of tears in her frustration, recognize that it's not her being hurt, it's her being frustrated, and respond appropriately, that it's just frustration. Work through whatever the frustrating issue is, figure it out, and then go back out on the field, and don't let the tears derail the training. It's very, very hard, I've found, for male instructors to deal with a woman whose eyes are leaking. Half the time she doesn't know why her eyes are leaking. It's often out of frustration. The last thing in that area to recognize is that her cycle for working through emotions is often significantly longer than a man's cycle for working through emotions. Guys will hit their peak of pissed within 60 seconds, 10 to 60 seconds, and they've got an immediate response to anger. And they've lost that response to anger, and the adrenaline is gone within 10 minutes. On the other hand, women have a tendency to take about 10 minutes to ramp up to that level of adrenaline and frustration and sometimes anger, and it will take 45 minutes for it to taper off. So if she needs to sit down for a little bit and cool off, she's not quitting for the day. Don't let her quit for the day. Get back up there, continue fighting. But recognize that her timing for working through emotions might be a little bit different. this is a PG episode, but please realize I've just described a different response cycle as well that you may have seen in your personal life. So those are the key things to recognize. Don't stop because of the tears. It's not because she's hurt. It's because she's dealing with a frustration. Giggles are also another way to work through frustration for a lot of women. I've been in a laughing fit that I couldn't stop after demolishing a city block. Look, it's pretty hard to explain to your commanding officer why the building is no longer standing while you're giggling. Recognize that giggles are in fact just a release for stress. Timing of emotions, and recognize there are physical differences that you may just have to work through.
Thank you, ladies, for your complete answers on that. We are running out of time, as we thought we might. So we're going to do one last question. In terms of what other fighters can do to support female fighters, what are 3 specific things that can be done at an intermediate and personal level, at a small group level, and at a society level?
As I said earlier, I'm no longer the center of the SCA universe, and I can't speak for all the SCA female fighters. So what I would recommend is that you speak directly to your fighters, to your female fighters, and say, what can I do to support you? What do you need from me? And I would recommend that at the personal level, at your small group level, and that will filter up to the society.
So some things you can have at the small group level is armor that fits women. Because her body is shorter, if she's using the longer body armor, it's going to give bruises up in the arm as she bends over. Look for anything that is a systemic problem with what she's experiencing and address it for her personally. Things that we can do at the society level, a lot of it we've already trying to see as equality, to recognize female knights when they become that level of excellence. But it really does start at the individual and the local area, encouraging people to get on the field, treating them as equals when they're there, making sure that they have armor that fits, making sure to address their questions, adjust style when it's necessary. A lot of women find different fighting styles are easier for them. Don't be afraid to start with a different style if that's what works for her. Take what works, toss what doesn't.
Thank you very much to all the knights who participated today. And thank you, of course, to Vesper for producing it. Without her, we would be lost. And to you, our audience. Without you, we have no one to have questions from or to give good advice to. I really enjoyed this discussion, and we're looking forward to episode 6 next week, which will be a rehash of popular questions and questions that we haven't been able to get to yet. Before we go, Vesper, can you tell people where they can find this recording?
Happily. Don't mind the puppies in the background. They may make noises. So if they're barking, they're saying hello to everybody that's watching. You can take a look at this recording. It will be saved on the Virtual Fighter practice page. However, do head over. There is a Female Roundtable Series, Knights Roundtable Series page. I'm not doing well with words today. It's been one of those days. But I'll be sure to post the link there. They are all being uploaded to YouTube as well. So we will have all of that information for you. I'll make sure to put a post of that today. I think that's our goodbye then, is it? Do I get the final words? All right.
I'll call us out.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. Everyone have a great week. Stay safe. It's a crazy, crazy world out there, and I hope to see all of you next week.
Good deal. Take care, guys.
Bye.